Hey, welcome to Dan's Model Works, and we are back at the clutter zone, the old workbench, and this is part 3 of our building of this, what I believe to be the original release of Tamiya's F16, and as I've stated in earlier videos, the tooling was actually done back in 1976, and according to Scalemates, it wasn't released by Tamiya ever again, so they probably kept it in production for I don't know, 2 or 3 years and then moved on to other things. So this could quite possibly date all the way back to 1976. And being part 3, this is how far we've gotten. Makes an awesome dart. And if you watched part 2, you'll know that if we take a really close look up inside there, you can see there's the front turbine of our engine has been added, and that was scratch built back in part 2. So now it's looking like time to get on to more of the final assembly, that is putting the wings on, tails, stabilators, things like that. So let's get to work. Now the first thing I was going to do this week is to put the very front of the air inlet onto the model. There's our air inlet in place. There's a little bit of a ridge right here, and I'll probably try sanding that just to reduce its size just a bit. Now here's the outlet of our engine, and it looks pretty good. Don't worry about the thickness of the walls here because there's still the actual variable geometry nozzle to go on, and it comes to a much finer point there. But I think before I actually glue this on, I'm going to paint all this up. I mean, that'll make it a little bit easier, and then when it comes time to paint the whole thing, I'll just mask this off with some tissue paper or something. So I'm going to start, I think, by just slathering a ton of black in there, and then I'll add some jet engine exhaust and metallics in there until I get it looking the way we want it. And as promised, black paint slathered in there. This will look a lot better once I add some testers, jet exhaust, and some gunmetal. There's the center section painted Humbrol gunmetal. And now for the color that is so useful for modelers who are doing jet aircraft or helicopters that are turbine powered, and that is the Model Master Jet Exhaust. I just think this is a great looking paint because it really does look like heat stained metal. Okay, there's the jet exhaust painted in there. I think I have to touch up a couple bits of black, but I think it looks pretty good. And here's a shot with the variable geometry exhaust on there, just so we can get some idea of what we're going to see. Now, it's always a good idea if there's going to be another part on to put it in place and say, all right, do I really need to do any more work with this? And I think what we can see, this should be pretty good. Now, believe it or not, I'm trying to come up with a good reason not to glue the wings on. Mainly because I'm afraid I'm going to glue them on and say, oh crap, I needed to do that first. However, I can't come up with a good reason not to glue the wings on, so I guess that's what you're going to do next. Now, when I test fit the wing, I find that when it's in place, there's a bit of just a little bit of a lip right here in this direction. So before I glue him on, I'm just going to lightly sand right here. Let's see if we can eliminate a bit of a fit issue before we glue her together. Glue, glue. Where's the glue? Got the Tamiya glue. I don't see the testers or the Flexifile stuff. Aha! It's in the main workshop where Natasha's working on her project. There, now that I have glue, I can glue things on. Funny how that works. So there's our port wing on, and there's just a bit of a gap right here between the wing and the fuselage. I'll be using a bit of white glue to fill that in. Basically, you apply the white glue, squeeze it in, and then you wipe off with a damp rag immediately, and that tends to fill any gaps like that. Now it's time to put the other wing on. Won't fit. There we go. There, she's starting to shape up now. Now we move on to the vertical tail. And am I the only one who thinks that the vertical tail on an F16 just doesn't look very substantial? I know once you actually put it onto the fuselage, just adding that one little bit down there seems to make it a lot taller, but on its own, not much there. I can't recommend enough that even on a kit like this Tamiya plane where everything has massive and solid lugs, that you always sight along the fuselage and make sure that things like the tail and the stabilators really are at the angle you want them. Because there's nothing worse than the glue sets up, you come back later and go, that's not right. Not much to say for putting the stabilators on other than that there's a little bit of cleaning up to be done on the inner edge here. And that'll just make it go on a little bit better. And I suppose the other thing is if you're going to pose your stabilators at a slightly different angle, decide now. Now, as we race along putting our big chunks together, when I test fit the nose, you can see that there's a little bit of a step here. The nose is actually a smidge larger than the fuselage. So I'm going to rub that down as much as possible before I fit it on, and that'll make equalizing that a bit easier. So there's our radome on. I'm not going to put the pointy bit on until the very end because I know I'm going to knock that off about half a dozen times. Next thing to go on is going to be the strakes down here. And if we look at the instructions, they give you the angle, 75 degrees, although you could probably just eyeball it by holding the fuselage up to the instructions. So there's our ventral stabilizers, strakes. Not sure exactly what the official designation is in place. And of course, you have to remember that they are larger towards the front than the back. And they're identical parts, actually. They're both, what we got here, they're both C8 in the instructions. What makes things a little difficult is the way you want to set the plane down is these are going to take the weight, so you're going to have to be careful with that. I think one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to drill a hole back here, and I'm going to install a hook, and that'll make it easier for me to paint. So I've got all the big pieces glued together, and it's time to get ready for painting. I've already given it a bath, basically in some hot soapy water, rinsed off with some clear water. And in anticipation of painting, I've installed an eye hook in its ass end here. And basically, this will just give me something I can hang it from when it's in the spray booth. So I'm going to go with the alternate paint scheme they give us in the Tamiya kit, which is basically what they thought the in-service paint scheme was going to be. It's a dark gray over light gray. It's kind of got some soft edges, kind of a blobby effect. I know into the 80s there was another paint scheme that was used mainly where the nose was a different gray than the rest of it, but I think I'm going to go with one that they supply in the kit, mainly because that's what the decals reflect. And not only that, I know that once it went into service, they clipped the corners of the stabilators. And of course, ours does not have that. Ours doesn't have that clipping. So a few weeks ago, I was like, okay, better make sure I buy the type of paint that I'm going to need. And this will be easy because Tamiya will tell me exactly what kind of paint from the range to use. Except, if we look on here, they're calling out colors. Here we go. But they don't have the identifiers for their paint range. And of course, this makes sense because in 1976, Tamiya did not have their own range of paints. So I'm having to guess. So I've just decided to go with these two right here. So I'm going to go with Royal, Light Gray, and Neutral Gray. And I think that'll be fine. And quite honestly, when it comes to grays, you put them all together, it's hard to tell which one is which anyway. All we need is a medium and a light gray to put together. I'm going to try to temporarily install the main landing gear doors in a closed position. And then that way they'll get painted at the same time as the rest of the airplane and they'll mask the inside. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do that with the nose gear bay. So I was puzzling over how I was going to mask off these landing gear bays. Masking tape didn't seem to really work and seemed to be far too much work. Now I know you can take tissue paper and wet it down and jam it in place. But I've heard of other people doing this, and basically you just take some Play-Doh and completely fill the recess. And it's cheap enough that whatever you got left, you can just throw away after it's been contaminated with paint. So we'll see how that works. There's our landing gear bays filled. And I've covered over the cockpit. And I was fretting over how I was going to cover the air intake, and then I remembered that there's an air intake cover supplied with the kit. I'm not going to use it, but all I did is pop that in place, and that'll keep my air intake nice and white. So, I think we're just about ready for paint. So we've got our light gray applied. We're back from the spray booth, and actually my daughter warned me that this might happen with the Play-Doh. She pointed out that overnight the Play-Doh was going to shrink. So I'm going to have to repack these spots with the Play-Doh. But I don't think that'll be a problem because it actually went in there really easy. So let's pull out the shrunken Play-Doh and see how it worked as a masking agent. So there we go. So that's how it did as a masking agent. And yeah, it comes out pretty good. I don't think I'm going to have any problems with getting the old Play-Doh out. So it's something you might consider next time you've got a weird shaped thing that needs to be masked, is you can use some Play-Doh. And there's a little bit of overspray going in right here, but the way Tamiya has you mount the doors, that won't be a problem. So there's the nose wheel bay with its plug taken out. So what I'm going to do, and I suggest you do the same thing if you ever use this Play-Doh masking method, is basically the Play-Doh should go in maybe within an hour of you actually doing the painting. So the next step for this is going to be, after I put fresh Play-Doh in, of course, is going to be painting the medium gray. And that's kind of a darker area on the main meat of the plane, leaving the edges a lighter gray. I know that's not what was used throughout the 80s, but since this basically represents the second prototype, that's probably the most appropriate paint scheme for this. Okay, I lied. The next step is actually blending in the nose, and I'll flash up an image here that shows exactly the offending area. And the thing is this is a case of sometimes it's not till you get a nice coat of light gray on here that you realize that the fit and finish of something isn't so great. So at any rate, this is the second application of Tamiya putty, and I'm going to sand this down, and then the tough part is going to be to reestablish the panel line between the radome and the rest of the plane. But I couldn't leave it the way it was. It was just too much of a dent. It really stood out, as you could see from the picture. So there's our nose joint smoothed out. However, we do need to reinstate the panel line that needs to run all the way around. So I'm going to be using a number 11 blade. Only I'm going to be using it backwards to scribe. Hopefully that won't go wrong. So there's our panel joint where it should be. Keep in mind, your blade should follow the existing panel line anyway, because the filler is going to put up less resistance than the styrene would. You just don't want your blade to wander and cause more damage than you're trying to repair. Now, in anticipation of painting the medium gray or darker gray, I've repacked our wheel wells with Play-Doh, because as I said earlier, it basically shrinks overnight, so you got to put it in within an hour or two of doing your painting. So I finished applying the medium gray and tried to follow the patterns they had suggested as close as I could. And this sort of soft, wavy sort of thing is something that I should probably do a little more often. I'm a little bit out of practice on it. Instead of using my really old basic airbrush, I use a Badger 350, which at least gives you a choice of nozzles. So let's get the Play-Doh out of here. Oh, and our landing gear bays are still nice and pristine white. Just what we want to see. There we go. Ready to move on. Next step will probably be a gloss coat so we have a good base for our decals. I've done a little bit of touching up around the cockpit. Now we're about ready to spray that gloss coat I was talking about. There we go, all shiny, gloss coated, and ready for decals. So I've painted the outside of our rear end of our engine and the exhaust gunmetal. And what I'd like to do is to just introduce some jet exhaust, kind of the brownish color, basically to the last 3/4 of the actual convergent divergent nozzle here. And I was thinking of dry brushing it, but I think I'm going to use my airbrush. I'm going to use the fine one. I'm going to see if I can just introduce that just into the end part there. I'm not sure how well the camera is going to pick it up, but I painted this area here jet exhaust, and I left this area pretty much the gun metal. And the idea is the farther you get towards the end, where the afterburner gases would really be overheating, the more brownish it gets. Next step is going to be to put a black wash on that. So there's our jet nozzle after having a wash of Tamiya flat black applied to it. A little darker than I originally intended, but it actually looks a lot richer and deeper than I thought it was going to be. So I think I'm going to live with it for a few days and see if I still like it after a few days. I might just go back and totally redo it. There's our engine exhaust just set in place, not glued in place yet, just to see how it looks with the rest of the colors. And actually, the more I look at it, the more I'm liking it. Well, we've got most of the main paint on and the gloss coat on. We're ready for decals. And I think that just about does it for Dan's Model Works for this week. And thanks for watching. And until next time, keep on modeling.